There's one more attraction I aim to see here in Thunder Bay before I continue my trip around Lake Superior to the east. If you remember what Thunder Bay cities were called before they were amalgamated together, one of them was called Fort William. Well, it's an actual fort, and it's still able to be visited, and it's one of the major attractions and meeting places here in town. The fort is now a large museum where visitors can learn about the fur trade and what life was like during the pioneering days of Canada's past. To give a little background, we really do need to talk about the companies that were competing for the greater shares of the fur trade here. Even though the country of Great Britain held land claims across much of Canada, it was mostly the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Companies that both owned the lion's share of the land. The Hudson Bay Company was given all the land that had rivers that drained into the Hudson Bay, a territory known as Rupert's Land. The Northwest Company came a little bit later, and its main focus was to break the monopoly the HBC had over the fur trade. They would be the company to establish the Grand Portage and eventually the Fort William trading posts. Each company would eventually establish forts that were not profitable, simply just to stake a land claim in an area. At times, there were two forts, one from each company, directly next to each other. Eventually, the two great companies would go to war with each other over the fur trade. That's right, two companies, both British, actively participated in battles over fur trading territory and the supplies and resources necessary to keep their outposts maintained and profitable. This war was known as the Pemmican War, where several forts were attacked and sieged and sometimes bombarded by cannon fire. Armed fur traders would post up along major rivers, raiding traders from the other company or blockading them entirely. Soldiers of both companies would invade trading posts, some of them fashioned into legitimate military-style forts, and they'd raid them of their supplies and fur pelts. One tactic was to remove doors, windows, hinges, and other useful materials that would make these forts habitable in winter months. Some forts were burned to the ground entirely. Fort William here in today's Thunder Bay, which was on the Northwest Company side, was attacked by a force from the Hudson Bay Company that doubled that of its own garrison. The traders of the fort burned any documents that would have given away their company's trading tactics. The HBC sent a small regiment of troops to the front gate, supposedly to negotiate, but as soon as the gates were open, a bugle sounded and troops rushed in. Eventually the fort was taken and held until the end of the war. After 9 years, the war finally ended when the government intervened and forced a merger between the two companies. The conflict had both companies losing money, and the Crown stepped in to force them to settle their differences. The Hudson Bay Company, the older of the two, would absorb the Northwest Company and go back to having a monopoly over the fur trade. Eventually, the combatants worked side by side peacefully with little to no animosity between factions. The Hudson Bay Company still exists today, actually. They are now a retail department store that dabbles in other services like credit cards, mortgages, and insurance, much like Canadian Tire. You can visit Fort William today, and man, it's pretty interesting to see how it was reconstructed. I went to the Fort William Historic Park and got myself a tour. On the outskirts of the fort, you find a camp that's been constructed in a manner that the Native Americans, more than likely the Ojibwe, would have had it. It was common for natives to camp near military forts in the US and Canada. They were the centers for trade and goods, and it was a place where trade deals could go down peacefully between groups without the threat of ambushes. Forts like these were also conveniently situated where all the roads and rivers would meet. The original Fort William closed for good in 1883, and the buildings were all eventually torn down or decayed into ruins. The original site of the fort is now the location of Thunder Bay's rail yard in its east end. In the 1960s, a movement to preserve the city's cultural heritage led to requests to rebuild the fort as a source of tourism revenue. Archaeologists had mapped out where all the structures once stood and gathered data to assist in the fort's reconstruction. Because the rail yard was an important economic industrial hub for Thunder Bay, it was decided that they would rebuild the fort at a plot 9 miles upstream instead of the original site. It would also put it in a more natural setting far from the city, assisting in the look, feel, and sound of authenticity. After 2 years of construction, Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip opened the fort in person in 1973. Over the course of the next few decades, more of the fort would be constructed until it reached its current 46 reconstructed buildings on 225 acres. It's one of the largest living history sites on the continent. One thing I find hilarious are the people that work there. The college students and teens that are working summer jobs there are also actors, pretending to be living in the fur trade age. If you mention things like cars or take out your cell phones, they'll either mock you or ask what these strange pieces of technology are. They do their best to stay in character, which really makes the fort a fun place to visit. They have everything from a hospital, carpenter and blacksmith houses, the tailors, armorers, a livery, canoe shed, farm animals in the stables, and so much more. Each accessible building also does its best to have something that's interactive. They go into the history of the fur trade and the geopolitical importance of the fort itself. The Northwest Company was a huge power in this region, and they were challenging the established order by competing with the Hudson Bay Company and their monopoly over the fur trade. Afterward, I ended up hanging out with a couple members of my tour group, and we spent the day going out for drinks and hanging out around the waterfalls. It really was a great day, and if you get the chance, I would absolutely suggest going to the Fort William Historical Park in Thunder Bay.